I want to tell you about a hardware store. Specifically, I want to tell you about the hardware store on Elm Street in Glenwood, Ohio, the one with the narrow aisles and the paint chip display that takes up an entire wall, and the particular smell of sawdust and machine oil that I have always found oddly calming. I have been going to Kowalczyk Hardware for 11 years. My ex-husband thought it was strange that I preferred it to the big box store on the highway. I thought his preference for the big box store said everything about the fundamental difference in how we understood the world. We divorced, eventually. The hardware store remained. My daughters think something happens to me in that store. Sophie, who is 34 and a pediatric nurse and has an opinion about everything she has ever encountered, said it to me first. We were in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in April, and I had just come back from Kowalczyk's with a new set of drawer pulls and some weather stripping and a very good mood that I had not particularly noticed I was in. Sophie looked at me the way she looks at patients she is trying to gently diagnose and said, "You always come back from that hardware store in a good mood. Have you noticed that?" I told her I came back in a good mood because I had accomplished something, because I had gone with a specific need and found exactly what I needed, and the price was reasonable. Because hardware stores are one of the few remaining places where things are simple. You have a problem? There is a solution. Here is the solution. The transaction is complete. I told her that I found this satisfying in a world that was mostly the opposite. Sophie looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee cup. Then she said, with the careful neutrality of a person choosing not to say what they are actually thinking, "Right, that was April." In September, my other daughter, Rachel, who is 31 and works in data analytics and approaches everything, including her mother's emotional life, as a pattern recognition problem, said something similar. We were walking in the park near my apartment, and I mentioned, in passing, that I needed to go to Kowalczyk's the following Saturday. Rachel said, "How is the man at Kowalczyk's?" I told her I did not know what she was talking about. She said, "The man who always helps you. The one you mentioned last time." I told her I had not mentioned any man. She said I had mentioned him twice. Actually, in the context of finding out about the weather stripping sale, and in the context of the drawer pulls I was still looking for. She said I mentioned him the way people mention things they are not quite aware they are mentioning. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote that love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. I did not think, in September, that this had anything to do with me. I was 61 years old, and I had been running my own life for 9 years, and I had excellent taste in drawer pulls, and I was not in love with the man at the hardware store. He was helpful. He was knowledgeable. He remembered what you had bought before, which was professionally useful and nothing more. That was all. That was entirely all. I am telling you this from the other side of it. From the place where I know the answer to the question my daughters were asking, and I was refusing to hear. The answer was not complicated. The answer was, in retrospect, obvious to everyone who had been paying the kind of attention that does not come pre-defended against its own conclusions. My daughters were paying that kind of attention. I was not. I want to tell you something about how I came to understand what my daughters had seen. Because the understanding did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way understanding tends to arrive when you have been resisting it. In fragments, over time, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but accumulating until the weight of them was no longer dismissible. The first fragment was the cold sensation in November that I have already mentioned. The second was a Tuesday in January when I found myself in the hardware store for a very legitimate errand involving grout, asking Graham a question about tile sealers that I had already researched thoroughly online and knew the answer to. I did not realize I was doing this until I was in the car afterward and replaying the conversation and thinking, I already knew that. I knew that before I walked in. Why did I ask? The third fragment was Sophie calling on a Sunday in February and asking, in her careful way, whether I had been back to the store lately. I said, yes, 2 Saturdays ago. She said, how was it? I said, fine. She said, just fine. I said I didn't know what she was asking. She said she was asking how it was. I said it was good, actually. She said, yeah, I thought so, and changed the subject. 3 fragments, none of them conclusive in isolation. Together, they pointed at something that my cataloging system was working very hard to keep filed under not applicable, and the cataloging system was beginning to strain. This is the story of what I missed and why I missed it and how long it took the truth to get through the very efficient defenses I had built against it. I am an excellent librarian. I spent 32 years helping people find exactly the information they were looking for. The irony of being myself, completely unable to locate a specific piece of information that everyone around me had already found. That irony is not lost on me. It did not become available to me until much later. But I am getting ahead of myself. The man at Kowalczyk Hardware was named Graham Elliot. He had been working there for 7 years. He was 63 years old, and he knew where everything in that store was, and why it worked, and what to do when it didn't. I knew none of this in September when Rachel asked her question. I had to think to remember his name. This is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it matters for everything that follows. I had to think to remember his name, and yet I had mentioned him twice, without being aware of it, in the space of a few months. He was already in me before I had decided to let him in. He had been accumulating, quietly, in the basement of my attention, while I was standing at the front door insisting there was no one home. I should tell you about myself before I tell you more about the store, because context matters, and I am someone who believes in context. My name is Ellen Marsh. I am 61 years old. I was a public librarian for 32 years, the last 14 of those as head of adult services at the Glenwood Public Library. I retired 2 years ago, early, because the library went through a budget restructuring that I did not agree with, and I had reached the age where disagreeing with a budget, restructuring, and then continuing to work under it seemed like a form of self-punishment I did not need. I left on good terms. The staff gave me a card signed by everyone and a gift certificate to a bookstore, and I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes, which I had not predicted and which I do not regret. I was married for 22 years to a man named Donald. The marriage was not bad in the way that unhappy marriages are bad. It was bad in the quieter way, the way of 2 people who were compatible on paper and genuinely fond of each other and had built a life together. And somewhere around year 18, both realized they had run out of things to say that they had not already said. We co-parented well. We were pleasant at the girls' events. We split our assets with unusual fairness and without lawyers, which our daughters still regard as the only thing about the divorce that was handled correctly. I have been on my own for 9 years. I have made it work. I have made it more than work. I have made it genuinely mine, which is different. I cook what I want and read what I want, and my apartment reflects entirely my as a taste, which runs to warm colors and good light and too many books and not enough surfaces to put them on. I have friends. I have my daughters. I have a Tuesday morning walking group that I initially joined for the exercise and stayed in for the company, which is generally how useful things work. I should mention the apartment because the apartment matters to this story in a specific way. When I moved in 9 years ago, it was what estate agents call move-in ready, which is a phrase that means someone else's decisions have been made for you. The color on the walls was a particular shade of off-white that is neither warm nor cool. The color of non-commitment. The fixtures were standard. The hardware on every cabinet and drawer was the kind selected by a developer who was trying to offend no one and succeeding at pleasing no one. Over 9 years, I have replaced almost all of it. Drawer pulls, cabinet hinges, light fixtures, switch plates, door stops. Not all at once, gradually as each thing became an irritant, and as I found something I actually liked. This is how Kowalczyk Hardware became a recurring element of my life. I needed things. They had them. Graham knew where they were. The apartment is now exactly what I want it to be. Warm colors on the walls. The hallway is the color Graham recommended, and he was right about the east window. The fixtures are all warm-toned. The drawer pulls throughout are a burnished bronze that I spent 6 months looking for and found, in the end, at Kowalczyk Hardware, suggested by Graham after I described exactly what I was looking for, and he said, "I think I have something. Come back Saturday, and I'll have pulled them for you." He had pulled 3 options, all of them correct. The one I chose was the one he had thought I would choose. He said so, without smugness, as a simple observation. I found this, at the time, impressive. I find it, now, something else. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that I was not lonely in any way I would have named. I was not looking for anything. I was not secretly hoping. I was a 61-year-old woman who had retired well and was living well, and went to the hardware store on Saturdays because she owned an apartment, and apartments require maintenance, and she preferred to choose her own drawer pulls rather than paying someone else to choose them. That is the full context. Now I will tell you what I was missing. The first time I went to Kowalczyk Hardware was 9 years ago. 2 months after I moved into the apartment. I needed a new shower head, a specific kind. Low-flow adjustables, the kind that the Boggs box store on the highway carries in 3 inferior versions. Graham was behind the counter. He asked what I was looking for, and I described it, and he walked me to exactly the right aisle and the right shelf, and pointed at 2 options and explained the practical difference between them in about 40 words. I bought the better one. It is still on my shower. It has been on my shower for 9 years, and I have never had a problem with it, and this is, I have come to understand, not entirely a coincidence. He knows things, not generically, specifically. He knows which grout sealer is worth the price difference and which ones are marketing. He knows which paint finish survives kitchen humidity and which ones the manufacturer describes optimistically. He knows that the plumbing fittings in pre-1990 Glenwood apartment buildings are a non-standard gauge, and that if you bring him the old fitting, he can find the match without making you drive to Columbus. I know all of this because over 9 years of Saturday mornings he has told me, in the practical and unglamorous way that useful knowledge gets shared, everything I needed to know to keep my apartment functioning. Here is what Sophie noticed, cataloged over time, with the thoroughness of someone who had been trained to observe vital signs. I stayed longer in the store than my errands required. Not a little longer, sometimes 45 minutes for a 10-minute errand. I told myself I was being thorough. I was looking at options. I was not impulsive in my purchases, which was true and also not the full explanation. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. Sophie had been in the store with me once. I had dragged her along on a particularly boring Saturday when I needed advice on a ceiling fan, and she had watched me ask Graham 3 questions about ceiling fan installation that I, a person who had installed her own ceiling fan the previous spring, demonstrably already knew the answers to. I later told Sophie I was double-checking. Sophie said she had observed my face during the double-checking, and that my face did not look like someone who was double-checking. I came home lighter. This is Sophie's word, lighter. She said it with the precision of someone who had been watching me come home for 30 years and knew the difference between my ordinary good mood and something else. She said I walked differently on hardware store Saturdays. I told her she was being fanciful. She said she was being accurate. Rachel's evidence was different. Rachel noticed what I said rather than what I did. She kept a running tally, which she did not tell me about until much later, and which I found both touching and slightly alarming. Over the course of a year, I had apparently mentioned Graham in 11 separate conversations. Not extensively. Not in the way you mention someone you are thinking about. In the way you mention a reliable fact about the world. The way you might mention that the Tuesday morning walking group meets at 9, or that the library on 5th has better parking than the one on Main. He appeared as a piece of information, a trusted source. Graham at the hardware store said the new grout formulation isn't worth the extra cost. Graham mentioned there's a good sale on weatherstripping in November, 11 times. I was unaware of all 11. Rachel had not been. I want to pause here and say something about self-knowledge, because it is relevant. I have always considered myself to be a person of reasonable self-knowledge. 32 years as a librarian teaches you, among other things, to examine your own assumptions. I believed in interrogating my own certainties. I believed in intellectual honesty. I believed these things genuinely and practiced them in most areas of my life. The library is a useful metaphor for how I tend to think. In a library, every piece of information has a place. It is cataloged, cross-referenced, retrievable. The system works because things are where they are supposed to be, and you know where to look for them. I had, without realizing it, built a similar system for my own interior life. Certain categories of information were cataloged in certain places. Romantic feelings, filed under retired, see also post-divorce, see also not applicable. The cross-reference was thorough. The system was efficient. The problem with an efficient cataloging system is that it is very good at keeping things in their designated place. The drawer marked not applicable does not open easily, even when the information inside has been incorrectly filed. Sophie and Rachel had been looking at an incorrectly filed document for 18 months. I had been maintaining the filing system. The area of my own heart was apparently exempt from this practice. The evidence that was obvious to two daughters who watched me from across the room had not found its way through the particular defenses I had constructed there. The ones that said, "You are 61 years old, you are post-divorce, you are doing well precisely because you are not open to this category of disruption." Those defenses were thorough, they were efficient, they were, in retrospect, a fortress built around the exact territory they were supposed to be protecting. I want to tell you what Graham was actually like because the story requires it, and because I have thought about it enough that I can now describe it accurately, which I could not have done at the time. He was 63, lean, with the kind of hands that come from a lifetime of working with them. Not rough in an unpleasant way, just specific. Capable. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and pulled them down when he was looking at something small, which he did with a gesture so habitual it had become invisible. He had a gray beard, neat, maintained without vanity. He wore the store apron over a flannel shirt most Saturdays, which gave him the appearance of a man who had arrived mid-task and would return to it shortly, which was, I think, accurate. He was not particularly talkative. He was not the kind of person who fills a room with personality. He was the kind of person who filled a room with competence, which is a different and rarer thing. When I asked him a question, he answered it. When I was in the aisle considering options, he would appear at the end of it and say, "If it's for the kitchen, use the matte finish. it hides the wear better, and then disappear again, as though he had been monitoring the situation from a reasonable distance and had arrived at the exact moment the information became useful. I thought of him, for most of those 9 years, as a kind of ambient professional resource, the way you think of a good pharmacist or a reliable mechanic, someone whose competence you rely on and whose presence you appreciate without attaching particular significance to it. This was the false belief. The truth, which the daughters had already identified, and which I was assembling, without knowing I was assembling it, this was that Graham was not treating me like a customer. He had not been treating me like a customer for a long time. The treatment had been so gradual in its specificity that I had categorized it as good customer service, which it was, technically, without noticing that good customer service does not usually include the following. He remembered what I had bought, not vaguely, specifically. 2 years after I had mentioned, in passing, that I was considering refinishing the hardwood floors and in the hallway, but hadn't decided, yet he mentioned unprompted that a particular brand of polyurethane had come in on sale and that it worked well on older hardwood. He had been holding that piece of information for 2 years, waiting for the relevant moment to deploy it. I found out later that he had mentioned to his stockroom colleague that if a woman named Ellen Marsh came in asking about floor refinishing, to let him know. He asked follow-up questions the way a person asks follow-up questions when they have been tracking a story. The leaky faucet in the bathroom. He asked 3 Saturdays later how the repair had gone. The new light fixture in the living room. He asked whether I had gotten the warm or cool LED. And when I said warm, he said, right choice, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose recommendation has been followed correctly. He remembered my daughters. I had mentioned Sophie once, in the context of needing a good first aid kit for a solo hiking trip she was taking. He asked about the hiking trip 6 weeks later. I had to think for a moment before I understood what he was referring to. He had not forgotten. He had also, apparently, remembered the year I mentioned that I was having trouble with the bathroom tap, not the dripping kind of trouble, but the slow start kind, the quarter-second delay between turning the handle and water arriving, that is more annoying than it is serious. I had mentioned it in passing, not as a question, just as a complaint. On my next visit, he had a solution ready, a particular type of washer replacement that addressed exactly that delay. He had looked it up in the intervening week. I had not asked him to. He had gone home or stayed after or done it during a quiet moment and found the answer to a problem I had not given him. I am a librarian. Finding answers to questions people have not fully formed yet is what I do. I know what it costs, in time and attention, in the specific act of carrying someone else's problem around in your head until the solution presents itself. It is not a casual thing. It is not what you do for everyone. It is what you do for the people whose problems you have, without deciding to adopt it as your own. He had adopted my bathroom tap. I did not know what to do with this information, so I continued filing it incorrectly for approximately 8 months. I want to tell you about a specific Saturday in late October, because it is the one that Sophie later said was the one that made her certain. Before that Saturday, I want to tell you something that I have verified since, and that I did not know at the time. Rachel, in the interest of her pattern recognition investigation, had visited Kowalczyk Hardware once on a Saturday without me, on the pretext of needing caulk. She had watched Graham interact with 4 different customers over the course of 45 minutes. She had noted the consistency of his professional attention. She had then noted what was different with me, on 2 previous occasions when she had been in the store at the same time. What was different, she told me later, was not the quality of attention, it was the direction of it, With other customers, his attention pointed outward. Here is the information. Here is the solution. Here is the product you need. Goodbye. With me, she said, his attention pointed inward. It tracked. It followed up. It treated what I said as something worth carrying forward rather than something to be resolved and released. Rachel described this to me in the February, after everything had become clear, sitting at my kitchen table with the particular satisfaction of someone whose data had proven correct. She said, "He listened to you, the way people listen to stories they want to know the rest of." I thought about that sentence for a long time. She had come with me to the store. She came occasionally when she needed something herself or when she was visiting, and I had an errand I couldn't avoid. We were in the paint section, and I was looking at a color for the hallway, holding 2 chips up against the wall and squinting, which is the most scientific method I have found for evaluating paint colors. Graham appeared at the end of the aisle. He looked at the 2 chips. He looked at the existing wall color, which was a slightly dingy off-white that had come with the apartment. He said, "The warm one. The cool one will make the hallway feel narrower than it is." I said that was what I thought too. He said, "You've got good light in there from the east window. Warm tones work with it instead of fighting it." I told him I didn't think he had ever seen my hallway. He said, "You mentioned the east window when you bought the blinds 2 years ago." He had been building a picture of my apartment from fragments of information collected over 2 years. I had not known this was happening. It seemed to me, in the moment, like excellent professional memory. Sophie, standing 3 feet away, had a different interpretation. She told me this in the car, afterward, with the careful patience of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something. "Ellen," she said. "She calls me Ellen when she is being serious. She has called me Mom most of my life, and Ellen for specific moments. That man knows which way your hallway faces. He remembered your east window from a conversation 2 years ago. He has been listening to you the way people listen when they are paying attention to you specifically." I told her she was reading into things. She said she was reading the things that were there. We did not resolve this disagreement on the drive home, and I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about the east window comment in the way that something you have filed as unimportant occasionally resurfaces because it turns out it wasn't. The complication arrived in November, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Patricia. Patricia worked at Kowalczyk Hardware on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She was perhaps 55, with short, practical hair and a direct manner, and an engagement ring on her left hand that caught the fluorescent light when she was restocking shelves. I had seen her before and exchanged the ordinary pleasantries of 2 people who occupy the same space without having a relationship. On the Saturday in November when I noticed Patricia, I noticed something else. Graham and Patricia were talking at the front counter with the ease of 2 people who had been talking for a long time. It was nothing. It was a conversation. But there was something in the ease of it. The way she finished a sentence he had started, the way he laughed at something she said before she finished saying it. That made a particular cold sensation move through me. I bought the caulk I had come for. I said good morning to Graham, who said good morning back and asked if I had found everything I needed. I said yes. I left. In the car, I sat for a moment. The cold sensation was still there, and I was now required to look at it directly, because a person of reasonable self-knowledge cannot feel a cold sensation in response to seeing a hardware store employee talking to a colleague and then simply drive home without examining the cold sensation. The cold sensation had a name, and the name was the thing I had been refusing to apply to anything involving that store and that man. I drove home. I called Rachel, not to tell her. I had not yet gotten to the point of telling anyone anything, but because Rachel has the particular gift of asking questions that inadvertently answer themselves. She asked how my day was. I said, fine, I'd been to the hardware store. She said, how's the man? In the tone she had been using for several months, the tone of someone who finds the situation gently amusing. He seemed fine, I said. He was talking to one of the other employees. A pause. Then Rachel said, in a different tone entirely, the data analyst tone, the tone of pattern recognition, you sound strange. I told her I did not sound strange. She said I sounded like someone who was trying not to sound strange, which was its own category of strange. I changed the subject. After we hung up, I sat in my reading chair for a long time looking at the east window, which did, in fact, get excellent morning light. I sat there for an hour. This is unusual for me. I am not a person who sits unproductively. I had a book on the table beside me, and I did not open it. I had a half-finished cup of tea, and I did not finish it. I sat and looked at the light in the hallway, the warm, amber, east window light that was exactly the color it should be, because a man at a hardware store had remembered, 2 years after I mentioned it, which way my apartment faced, and I thought about what that meant. It meant he had been listening, not professionally, not as a customer service strategy. In the way that a person listens when the other person has become specific to them, when they are no longer an aggregate of customer interactions, but a particular individual whose particular situation they have been tracking. I thought about the word tracking. It sounds clinical. It was not clinical. I was beginning to understand the opposite of clinical. It was the way you follow a story because you are interested in how it continues. He had been interested in how my story continued. The cold sensation from the Patricia Saturday had a different name now. I had been calling it discomfort. That was the wrong name. The right name was the name I was still, in the reading chair, in the east window light, only just permitting myself to use. In the week between the Patricia Saturday and the following one, I had several distinct experiences of my own mind that I found instructive. On Sunday evening, I thought about the east window comment again and noticed I was thinking about it not with the mild interest of someone reviewing a professional interaction, but with the specific and pointed interest of someone who is trying to understand what something meant. This was new. I'd been not trying to understand what things meant for approximately 9 years. On Tuesday, I mentioned to Beverly at the Tuesday walking group that there was a man at the hardware store who was very knowledgeable. Beverly is 64 and has been widowed for 3 years and notices things about other people with a precision that comes from having paid close attention to one person for 30 years and then having to redirect all that attention somewhere. She looked at me and said, "How knowledgeable?" I said, "Extremely knowledgeable about hardware," she said. "Is that what you said?" I said, "Yes." I had said knowledgeable about hardware. What else would I mean? Beverly said nothing, but she walked the next half mile with the expression of someone who is being diplomatically quiet. On Thursday, I found myself at my kitchen table with no particular reason, thinking about whether he was happy, not whether the store was doing well or whether the job suited him, whether he, personally, was happy. This was not a thought I had been prepared for. I set it down carefully and thought about something else, which worked for approximately 11 minutes. The following Saturday, I almost did not go. I had 2 reasons to go. I needed wood filler for the bathroom cabinet, and I had been meaning to look at a particular kind of doorstop, and both reasons were legitimate, and neither of them was the real reason I almost did not go, which was that I was afraid of what would happen if I walked in, and the cold sensation from the previous Saturday presented itself again, and this time I could not file it under anything except its actual name. I went anyway. partly because the wood filler was genuinely necessary, and partly because avoidance is not a strategy I respect in other people. And I try not to practice it in myself. Patricia was not there. This was a Saturday, her day off. I noted this fact and then noted that I had noted it, and spent approximately 30 seconds being severely annoyed with myself. Graham was at the counter. He said good morning. He asked about the bathroom cabinet. I had mentioned it the previous week, the swollen corner, the way it no longer closed cleanly. He had thought of a solution and wanted to tell me about it. He talked me through the wood filler application with the quiet specificity that he brought to everything, his reading glasses down, his hands demonstrating in the air the direction of grain, the correct angle for the spatula. I watched his hands as he was talking. I have thought about that moment many times since. The watching his hands moment, because it was not the watching of a person assessing competence. It was something else. It was the watching of a person who has, without deciding to, become interested in the specific reality of another person. The way they move, the way they think through a problem in 3 dimensions, the way their attention is entirely on the thing in front of them, without performing the attention. I bought the wood filler. I bought the door stop. I went home. That afternoon I called Sophie. I told her I thought she might have been right about the hardware store. I said it in the tone of someone who has come to a conclusion, under duress, and is delivering it as briefly as possible. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know. How long have you known? I asked. About 18 months, she said. 18 months. She had been watching this for 18 months and had said it only once and then waited, with a patience that I now understand was love taking the form of restraint. She had watched her mother build an excellent case for the wrong conclusion and had not argued against it because she knew I needed to arrive there myself. What do I do? I said. I am not someone who asks that question easily. Sophie said, you could start by going back next Saturday and actually looking at him. I went back the next Saturday. Sophie's instruction had been actually look at him, and I took it literally, which is what I do when I am both nervous and trying to be honest. He was helping someone in the plumbing aisle when I came in, an older gentleman who was clearly out of his depth. He was holding a pipe fitting with the look of someone who had brought it in as evidence, but was not sure what crime it pointed to. Graham was talking him through it with the same patient specificity he brought to everything. What the fitting was, what it connected to, what the options were, which one was the right choice for his specific situation. The older gentleman left the aisle looking considerably more confident than he had arrived. I watched this, not covertly. I was standing at the end of the aisle pretending to look at caulk guns, which is the kind of pretending that fools no one and least of all yourself. I watched him with Sophie's instruction operating in the back of my mind. Actually, look. What I saw was this, a man who was exactly the same with everyone. The same patience, the same specificity, the same quality of attention. The older gentleman with the pipe fitting had received it. I had received it. The woman who came in behind me looking for a very specific shade of primer for a very specific project, she received it too. He moved through the store with a kind of practiced care that was directed at whoever was in front of him, without hierarchy, without calculation. He was kind to everyone. This was the exact thing Rachel had warned me about 3 years ago. She had said it gently, as a question. You know he's like that with everyone, right? And I had said yes, of course, and I had believed it. And it had been, for a long time, the ceiling of my understanding. But watching him now, with Sophie's instruction running, I began to see what I had been missing. Because yes, he was the same quality of attentive with everyone. But there was something that was not the same. The follow-up questions about Sophie's hiking trip. He had not asked the man with the pipe fitting about his daughter's hiking trip 6 weeks later. The east window comment, the 2-year-old detail retrieved and applied at exactly the right moment. I had not heard him do that with anyone else. The knowledge of my November Weatherstripping's visit that he brought up unprompted the following March, the sale he had made a note of for me. I stood in the paint section for a while after watching the plumbing aisle scene, doing what Sophie had instructed and actually looking, not at the paint, at the store, at the particular environment he had been working in for 7 years and what it said about him that he was still there. He could have worked somewhere larger, a big box store, a commercial supplier. He had the knowledge for it. He had the manner for it, the patient, specific, non-condescending manner that is actually quite rare and quite valuable in any environment. He was in a small family hardware store on a Saturday morning, helping a man with a pipe fitting he had probably seen 100 times before, with the same attentiveness he would have given to the first time. I thought about what that said about priorities, what it said about someone who had chosen to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing, without the ambition that makes people move through places rather than settling into them. Then I thought, I have been coming to this store for 9 years, and I am only noticing this now. And the reason I am only noticing it now is that noticing it requires looking at him as a specific and particular person, rather than as a useful, professional resource, and I had been very careful not to do that. He came to the end of my aisle. "Wood filler working out?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Cabinet closes cleanly now." He nodded. He looked at the caulk guns I had been pretending to examine. "You looking for something?" I had been a librarian for 32 years. Librarians ask questions for a living. We help people find what they are looking for. We do not, as a professional class, struggle with direct inquiry. I stood in the caulk gun aisle at Kowalczyk Hardware and asked the most direct question I had, asked in approximately 9 years. "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with hardware?" He looked at me, not surprised, exactly. More like a person who has been patient for a long time and has just been given a signal that the patience is about to be useful. He said, "Sure," I said. "The east window. You remembered that from 2 years ago. The primer shade from last spring. You remembered that, too. And Sophie's hiking trip. You ask about things I mentioned once. Months later." I stopped. Then, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He took his reading glasses off his forehead. Not to read anything, just to hold them, which I had seen him do when he was thinking. "I listen to what people tell me," he said. "You listen to everyone," I said. "I do," he said. He looked at the glasses in his hand. Then he looked at me. "I remember more of what you tell me." The store was its usual Saturday morning self around us. A family 2 aisles over. Someone's cartwheel squeaking on the concrete floor. The particular ambient sounds of a hardware store on a Saturday. I stood in all of this and felt something that I had been keeping very far from myself arrive, quietly and without fanfare, in the room. "I see," I said. "Do you?" he said. He was not being ironic. He was asking. I thought about what Iris Murdoch wrote, that love is the difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. I had been very good at keeping other people at a theoretical distance. I had been, without knowing it, keeping Graham Elliot at a theoretical distance for 9 years, while he was standing 12 feet away in a flannel shirt, remembering which way my hallway faced. "I think I'm beginning to," I said. He put the reading glasses back on his forehead. He looked at me for a moment, calm, patient, the expressions of a man who has been waiting without pressure and is in no particular rush now that the waiting appears to be ending. "I'm here most Saturdays," he said. "I know," I said. "I've noticed. I called Sophie from the parking lot. I did not wait until I got home. I sat in my car in the Kowalczyk Hardware parking lot on a Saturday morning in December and called my eldest daughter and said, 'You were right,' Sophie said. 'I know.' 18 months, I said. Longer, actually, she said, but I started keeping track at 18 months. Before that, I was just noticing. I asked her why she hadn't said more. She said she had said exactly one thing once and watched me dismiss it, and had concluded that I needed to find my own way to the answer because that was how I operated, and she had been my daughter long enough to understand how I operated, she said. You had to be ready to look. I couldn't make you look. I could just wait. This is, I think, the most accurate description of how I work that anyone has ever given me. I have to be ready. I could not be hurried. The evidence could accumulate, and the daughters could notice, and the answer could be sitting in the middle of a hardware store aisle, waiting for me to find it, and none of it would register until I was ready to look. Sophie had understood this and had waited with the exact right amount of patience. I told her I appreciated the patience. She said, I'm calling Rachel. Rachel, when Sophie called her, apparently said finally and nothing else. Rachel's economy with language, when the situation calls for it, is something I have always admired. She called me herself that evening. She asked 3 questions in rapid sequence, which is her interview style. How long had he been interested? How long had I known? Did I feel stupid for taking so long? I said I didn't know the answer to the first question yet. For the second, I had known, in the way of knowing things before you know them, for a long time, maybe a year, maybe longer. And for the third, not stupid, exactly, humbled. There is a distinction. Stupid implies a failure of intelligence. Humbled implies a failure of honesty, of the specific honesty required to look at what is actually in front of you and call it what it is. I had failed at the honesty. I had not failed at the intelligence. The evidence had been there. I had been filing it wrong on purpose, which is not stupidity. It is self-protection. And self-protection, when it runs past its useful term, becomes its own form of loss. Rachel said, You didn't lose anything. You just took longer to find it. She is 31 and works in data analytics, and sometimes she says something that reminds me she has been watching me be a person her entire life and has formed conclusions I did not know she had reached. I have thought, since, about the question my daughters were asking, and I was refusing to hear. Why him? Why now? The answer, when I finally had it, was not complicated. It was the same answer it always is, I think, when you find something real in the middle of an ordinary life, because he saw me, not the version of me I presented to the world, the competent retired librarian, the capable single woman, the person who researched her drawer pulls before purchasing them, the version underneath that, the one who comes to the hardware store and asks questions she already knows the answers to, because it is one of the few places where she feels, quietly and without it being remarked upon, seen. He knew which way my hallway faced. He had remembered Sophie's hiking trip. He had held a November sale in his memory for 2 years, against the possibility that I might need it. He had been building a picture of me, one small specific detail at a time, with no agenda other than the fact that I was worth the building. The question was never really why him. The question was always why I refused to see what he was doing. And the answer to that question I have already given you. I had decided I was past the season of being seen in that particular way. I had made peace with that. And peace, when it is genuine and not a defeat, is a difficult thing to give up even for something better. He asked me to dinner the following Saturday. He said it in the same direct and unhurried way he said everything. He came to find me in the paint aisle, where I had no legitimate business that week and had gone anyway, and he said, There's a place on 4th Street I've been meaning to try. I think you'd like it. Would you like to find out? I asked him how he knew I would like it. He said the owner had been in the week before buying materials for a renovation and had mentioned the restaurant had a good selection of obscure wines and a very good steak, he said. You mentioned last spring that you had started buying better wine since you retired, and you've bought the wood filler twice, which means you pay attention to how things are made. I thought it might be the right place. He had built the recommendation from two pieces of information collected months apart. He had been paying attention the way people pay attention when they intend to use the information for something. I had been a librarian for 32 years. I understood reference. I understood what it meant when someone had done the research. I said yes. I said it without the pause I would have expected from myself. I said it the way you say yes when you have already been answering yes for a long time, without saying the word. He smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was the smile of a patient man to whom patience has just yielded the thing he had been patient for. The daughters were insufferably pleased. Rachel sent a one-word text, finally. Sophie called and said she wanted all the details, and I gave her some of them, which is the appropriate proportion to share with a daughter. She said at the end of the call, "You seem different." I asked her different how. She said, "You seem like someone who stopped arguing with something." She was right. I had spent 9 years arguing with a particular truth that was waiting for me in that store, patient as its owner, unhurried, holding a piece of information it had been saving until I was ready to hear it. When I finally stopped arguing, the truth was entirely intact. Nothing had been lost by my taking so long. I still go to Kowalczyk Hardware on Saturdays. I still have opinions about drawer pulls. I still find the smell of sawdust and machine oil oddly calming. Some things do not change when love arrives. The hardware store is the same store it always was. I am, apparently, a different customer. If you found yourself in this story, if you recognize the particular self-deception of a person who has filed something important under unimportant and kept the filing very tidy, I hope you'll stay. There are more stories here about the things we build defenses against and the things that are patient enough to wait for the defenses to come down, come back. There is always another question worth asking.